98 Africans reached Annapolis Harbor on September 29, 1767, carried across the Atlantic aboard a ship called the Lord Ligonier. 42 others had died during the brutal crossing. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old Mandinka youth, a trained fighter who would spend the next 55 years refusing to let the world strip him of the name he was born with. Records from Pennington County, Virginia, list a slave purchased that October and assigned the name Toby. But what those neat, inked lines don't reveal, what plantation books purposely avoided, and what family Bibles quietly erased, was a deliberate effort to wipe out not only a man's identity, but the living memory of an entire culture. This is the story of how one African man reshaped the very cruelty meant to shatter him into a legacy that would survive long after his captors were gone. What you're about to hear has been blurred by nearly 2 centuries of omission, and the truth is far more disturbing than anything most people have ever been told. Before we continue with the life of the man who was renamed Toby, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and click the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And we'd love to know, drop a comment telling us which state or city you're listening from right now. The details of what unfolded next come from sources that took nearly 200 years to resurface. The Gambia River cut through West Africa like a wound that refused to heal, carrying British vessels deeper inland than any other waterway along that coast. By 1767, the British post on James Island had processed tens of thousands of kidnapped Africans, yet the hunger for labor on Virginia's tobacco plantations had grown to unprecedented extremes. Ongoing conflicts between local kingdoms created openings for slave raiders, and the Royal African Company paid high prices for young men specifically trained in warfare. A small Mandinka settlement called Juru, roughly 2 miles from the British stronghold, was home to the Kinte lineage, renowned blacksmiths and spiritual leaders who kept their traditions alive despite constant danger. The Mandinka people had endured for centuries by perfecting the art of appearing compliant while safeguarding their customs in secret. Children learned to keep their distance from the river, to avoid traveling alone into the forest, and to flee at the first sign of the Slati, African raiders working for European buyers. Kunta Kinte understood these risks more than most. As a blacksmith, he'd forged the very iron shackles used on prisoners. He had heard the stories of entire villages emptied overnight, of families torn apart and shipped away forever. He taught his eldest son the ancestral craft of drum making, a tradition, yes, but also a survival skill. A young man who could build instruments might be kept alive aboard a slave ship to maintain the captives' morale. The boy's birth name held deep meaning in Mandinka culture. Kalen, meaning complete or whole, was reserved for firstborn sons expected to carry a family's legacy. At 17, he'd completed his warrior training, learned to hunt with a spear, and could recite his lineage 7 generations back. Village elders often spoke of him as someone destined to become a respected leader. One early morning in July of 1767, Kalen ventured into forest near Juru to gather wood for drum making. The particular hardwood he required grew about 3 miles from the village, far enough to be risky, but close enough that young men made the journey regularly. He carried no weapon. Mandinka warriors never hunted on sacred gathering grounds, and Kalen walked with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths since childhood. What he didn't know was that British Colonel O'Hagan's forces had arrived at James Island 3 days earlier with urgent orders to secure a massive shipment of captives for Virginia's labor crisis. The Lord Ligonier lay anchored offshore, its captain under pressure to fill all 140 spaces before the weather shifted. The network's African raiders had already been activated. Each man promised bonuses for capturing youths between 15 and 25. For slates had been tracking Kalen since the moment he stepped away from a village. They were experienced hunters of people, men who'd perfected ambush tactics through dozens of successful raids. They knew how to strike silently, how to overwhelm a target before he could cry out, and how to bind him so completely that resistance was impossible. The attack unfolded with terrifying precision. The first blow, a heavy wooden club, smashed into Kalen's shoulder, knocking him to his knees. Before he could make a sound, a hand clamped over his mouth while others pinned down his arms. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, binding his wrists, blindfolding him, forcing a gag into place. In barely 90 seconds, Kalen had gone from free young man to saleable cargo. The raiders dragged him 3 miles to a holding area near the river, where 24 other prisoners sat chained within a crude pen. Some came from nearby villages. Others had been seized weeks earlier and marched from far inland. All of them carried the same look, shock so deep that the mind could not keep up with the disaster. For 3 days, Kalen remained inside that enclosure while raiders hunted for more captives. The conditions were intentionally brutal. Almost no food or water, scorching heat during the day, chilling winds at night, and guards who beat anyone who spoke too loudly. The psychological damage was as calculated as the physical suffering. Their goal was simple: subdue the spirit before the journey even began. When the Lord Ligonier's crew arrived to collect their human cargo, they brought along the ship's surgeon, a British doctor named William Tompkins. His task was to examine each prisoner for illness or injury that might reduce their sale price. The inspection was methodical and humiliating, checking teeth, probing muscles, and assessing bodies with the same detached scrutiny one might use when selecting livestock. Of the 32 captives brought forward, he rejected 7. Kalen passed without issue. At 17, he matched perfectly the profile sought by Virginia plantation owners: strong, young, and accustomed to physical labor from years spent assisting in his father's forge. The British paid the raiders in rum, cloth, and bars of iron. Standard goods of the slave trade were exchanged: rum, cloth, and iron, the common currency of human trafficking in that era. Kalen was now legally the property of Captain Thomas Darvish, noted in the ship's manifest with only the barest description. Male, approximately 17 years, Mandinka origin. The transfer from shore to ship happened in small boats that carried 10 captives at a time. The British sailors performed this task with practiced efficiency, fully aware that at this stage, when prisoners first saw the massive vessel meant to haul them across the ocean, often triggered last-second attempts to flee or throw themselves overboard. To prevent this, the crew kept the captives bound in chains and rushed them through the process. Kalen's first sight of the Lord Ligonier revealed just how vast the operation truly was. This wasn't a small raid meant to supply a few traders. It was an industrial machine perfected over decades. The ship itself was built for transporting human beings, its decks modified to cram the highest number of bodies into the smallest possible space. Through narrow slits in the wooden hull, Kalen could see other captives already packed inside, their faces dimly visible through the openings. Once aboard, the British crew forced the new captives below deck, delivering them into conditions that defied human imagination. The slave hold measured roughly 5 feet in height, meaning no one could stand upright. Every person was allotted a space about 16 inches wide and 6 feet long, barely enough room to lie flat. The air was suffocating, hot, and heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and confinement. Wooden platforms split the hold into 2 levels, doubling the number of captives that could be stuffed into each compartment. The crew chained prisoners together in pairs, right ankle to left ankle, destroying any possibility of independent movement. Additional chains were bolted to the walls and connected to the shackles, preventing anyone from getting near the stairs. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical restraints. These chains made it clear that survival depended entirely on the person you were tethered to. Kalen found himself shackled to a man named Fandu, taken from a village more than 50 miles inland. They did not share the same dialect, but both spoke enough Mandinka-rooted language to communicate essential needs. Fandu had already been imprisoned for 2 weeks and understood the rhythms aboard the ship. When the crew delivered food, how to adjust your body to avoid unbearable cramps, and which sailors were most likely to administer random beatings. The Lord Ligonier remained anchored offshore for another week, while Captain Darvish negotiated for additional captives. Conditions below deck worsened rapidly. The British provided food only once a day, a thick mixture of beans, yams, and sometimes fish dumped into communal buckets shared by 10 people at a time. Water arrived twice a day in tiny rations, leaving everyone in a state of constant dehydration. Waste buckets overflowed quickly, and the crew's solution was to hose down the deck every 3 days, treating the prisoners no differently than livestock. Disease spread with ruthless speed. Dysentery took hold within days, causing severe weakness and dehydration. A fever swept through one corner of the hold, killing 4 men in the first week alone. The ship's surgeon examined the sick only to determine whether they were likely to recover enough to be sellable. His duty was to protect the captain's profits, not to provide treatment. On July 5, 1767, the Lord Ligonier departed the African coast with 140 captives chained in its belly. Captain Darvish wrote in his logbook that he was pleased with the quality of the cargo and anticipated a profitable voyage. What he chose not to record was the relentless cruelty required to keep so many terrified, desperate human beings under control. The Middle Passage, the agonizing route from West Africa to the Americas, typically lasted between 6 and 12 weeks depending on the winds. The Ligonier's course would take it past the Cape Verde Islands, then southwest across the ocean's widest expanse before catching the trade winds toward the Caribbean and finally up the coast to Annapolis. For the captives, time lost meaning. The voyage became an endless cycle of pain, broken only by short intervals on deck. British regulations require that slaves be brought topside once a day for forced exercise, 30 minutes of marching or shuffling while still shackled. Supposedly, this reduced the death rate. In truth, it served only to preserve the ship's profits. These brief moments in daylight gave the captives their first chance to communicate across language barriers and begin to understand the true scale of their captivity. Kalen's training as a warrior offered him nothing here. All the lessons on honor, courage, and resistance seemed meaningless when you were chained in darkness, weaponless, ignorant of your destination, and too weak from hunger to think clearly. The psychological torment was deliberate, isolating people from their own language, starving them, exhausting them, and keeping them blind to the route ahead. Still, Kalen observed patterns in the crew's behavior. The sailors who delivered food were less attentive during storms. The daily exercise occurred at nearly the same time each day unless weather forced a delay. The ship's surgeon rarely descended into the hold except for formal inspections. These observations didn't offer any immediate escape, but they revealed that the ship operated on predictable routines that someone determined enough might someday exploit. Others made similar discoveries. A man named Katie, once a trader before his own capture, spoke a little English from dealings with British merchants. He listened closely to crew members' conversations and repeated what he understood to the captives around him. The ship, he explained, was bound for a place the sailors called Napoles, which many recognized as a mispronounced Mandinka version of Annapolis. There, the captives would be auctioned and forced into tobacco labor. The British expected that most would die within 10 years due to the sheer brutality of plantation life. This knowledge created a painful conflict. Some captives whispered about launching a rebellion if enough of them were ever brought on deck at the same time. But shackles made coordination nearly impossible, and the British crew was heavily armed with muskets and cutlasses. A failed uprising would mean immediate execution for everyone involved. The choice was terrifying. Attempt escape and almost certainly die, or submit to slavery with the faintest hope of surviving long enough to someday regain freedom. Kalen listened to these arguments but remained silent. His father had always taught him that a true warrior chooses his battles only after realistically judging. Victory depended not on pride or desperation, but on realistically judging whether a fight could be won. And everything about their situation made rebellion suicidal. Still, Kalen stored away every observation, every shift in routine, every lapse in discipline among the British crew, every structural weakness in the ship's procedures that might someday matter. 3 weeks into the voyage, a fever tore through the hold with horrifying speed. The very conditions that made the space unbearable, extreme heat, stagnant air, contaminated water, and almost non-existent sanitation, created a perfect incubator for disease. Men who had already survived raids, marches, imprisonment, and transport to the ship now died shackled to their partners. Their bodies remained in place for hours, sometimes days, until crew members finally noticed and dragged them away. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Tompkins, documented each death in his log with cold, clinical detachment. According to his calculations, a 15% death rate was normal on slaving voyages. 30% required review. Anything above 40% meant the captain could face reprimand for mismanagement by the Royal African Company. To these men, the dead were not human beings lost. They were inventory that impacted profit margins. Kalen's partner, Fandu, developed a fever during the 4th week. The symptoms were immediate and unmistakable. Trembling chills despite the suffocating heat, crushing headaches, drifting delirium. Fandu remained aware enough to understand what was happening. In a moment of heartbreaking clarity, he apologized to Kalen for what he knew would follow. Within 2 days, he was gone, and Kalen spent nearly 18 hours chained to his lifeless body before the crew finally noticed and removed it. They did not give Kalen a new partner. Instead, they shortened his ankle chain and fastened it directly to the wall, granting him even less movement than before. The isolation wasn't intentional. The crew simply didn't have enough living captives to repair everyone, but it deepened the psychological torment. For weeks afterward, he existed in a near-complete sensory void, surrounded by suffering but unable to communicate with anyone in a meaningful way. Just when it seemed the full horror of the Middle Passage had revealed itself, conditions aboard the Lord Ligonier grew worse. The weather turned violent as the ship neared the Atlantic center, and what happened next would test the will to survive of every soul still breathing. If you're finding this account as disturbing as we are, hit the like button to support this content. Share the video with someone who needs to understand this history, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Now, let's continue the nightmare that was still unfolding. The storm struck during the 7th week at sea. Late summer Atlantic storms were notorious for testing even seasoned crews, and although Captain Darvish had crossed this route more than 20 times, each voyage could bring weather capable of sinking a ship within hours. The warning signs came at dawn: a sudden shift in the wind, darkening clouds building along the western horizon, and an ominous drop in air pressure that made the atmosphere feel heavy and smothering. Darvish ordered the crew to secure all cargo and prepare for violent seas. For the captives chained below, this command changed nothing. They remained bound in their cramped positions as the ship began to pitch and roll. Men who had been motionless moments before were suddenly slammed against their restraints as the vessel lurched sideways. Overhead, the wooden platforms groaned and flexed, threatened collapse under the shifting weight. The worst came with the water. Atlantic storms hurled waves across the deck, and on slave ships that water had only one place to go, down into the holds through the ventilation grates. Within hours, 6 inches of seawater sloshed across the slave deck, mixing with human waste, spilled food, and filth that had accumulated for weeks. The shackles prevented anyone from lifting themselves above it. The water washed repeatedly over their legs, hips, and chests. Kalen had experienced tropical storms in Africa, but nothing could prepare him for the helplessness of being chained during a maritime disaster. The ship would surge upward on a wave, hang suspended at its crest, then plunge downward with enough force to lift bodies momentarily off the planks before smashing them back down. The sounds were nightmarish. The groaning of timbers, the panic shouting of the crew above and all around him. The cries of captives convinced the ship was sinking and they would drown in the dark, still shackled. The storm lasted 4 days. During that time, the crew made no attempt to bring food or water to the hold. Their own survival took priority over preserving their cargo. The captives endured a hellish combination of starvation, dehydration, violent motion, and a constant, paralyzing fear that the next massive wave would shatter the hull and send them all to the bottom of the sea. Several men broke entirely under the strain, screaming until their voices died, then continuing to scream silently with mouths open and eyes glazed with terror. When the weather finally calmed, Dr. Tompkins descended into the hold to assess the toll. 18 more captives had died. some from physical injuries inflicted by the storm's force, others from drinking the contaminated water in desperate attempts to survive, and a few for what appeared to be sheer psychological collapse. The surgeon ordered the bodies thrown overboard, then instructed the crew to hose down the deck, without bothering to move the survivors first. The Lord Ligonier's crossing revealed the cold logic governing the transatlantic slave trade. Captain Darvish had left Africa with 140 captives. The storm brought the death toll to 42, a 30% loss, higher than he preferred, but still deemed acceptable for a voyage that had encountered severe weather. The Royal African Company would calculate profits based on the 98 survivors, subtract operational costs, and determine whether the captain deserved a bonus or criticism. For Kalin and the others, the storm's passing offered no relief. Fewer captives meant even less incentive for the crew to maintain basic sanitation. The corpses were gone, but the contamination remained. Illness spread unchecked, worsened by infected wounds from a violent thrashing during storm. The surgeon offered no treatment. His duty was to decide whether men might survive long enough to be sold, not to heal them. By the 9th week at sea, something inside Kalin's mind began to shift. The crushing psychological weight of so many, trauma, isolation, and helplessness had slowly been wearing away at his sense of identity. He had watched men descend into madness, witnessed death become so constant that its presence no longer provoked emotion, and felt pieces of his own self slipping away under the relentless assault on his humanity. But there was one thing his captors could not strip from him: his name. In Mandinka culture, a name carried spiritual weight. It linked a person to their ancestors, anchored them within their community, and defined their essential being. Kalin meant whole or complete, a word his father chose to signify that this son was destined to fulfill a meaningful role in their lineage. As long as Kalin remembered his name, remembered the words spoken over him at his naming ceremony, remembered the lineage that stretched 7 generations behind him, some vital piece of him remained outside British control. Around him, other captives were beginning to lose even that. Under the unending trauma of the Middle Passage, memory itself became unreliable. Men who had boarded the ship, knowing exactly who they were now, struggled to recall basic truths of their former lives. Languages blurred. Rituals that had felt eternal in Africa now flickered like fragments of fading dreams. The British did not have to actively erase these identities. The conditions they created performed the erasure for them. Kalin responded by creating a private ritual that would carry him through the final weeks of the voyage. Every morning, during the brief period on deck for enforced exercise, he recited his entire lineage silently. I am Kunta Kinte, son of Amaro Kinte, grandson of Kaiba Kinte, descendants of the holy men of the Kinte line of Jiru. He recalled his father's teachings, replayed lessons about blacksmithing and drum making, remembered the foods of his village, the smell of the fires, the sound of the forest. These memories became his resistance, proof that he existed as a whole human being despite the British attempt to reduce him to cargo. During the 11th week, the Lord Ligonier finally sighted the North American coast. The appearance of land triggered visible changes among the crew. They scrubbed the ship more thoroughly, repaired damaged equipment, and even improved the captives' food slightly. This was not compassion. It was business. Buyers in Annapolis would inspect the human goods, and weak or sick captives fetched lower prices. On September 29, 1767, the ship entered Annapolis harbor. For the captives, the moment carried an impossible mixture of emotions. The voyage that had killed 42 of their number was finally ending. But what awaited them was a lifetime of enslavement in a land where they knew neither the language nor the customs, and where escape was nearly impossible. The British followed a systematic process for receiving slave ships. First, harbor officials boarded to verify the human cargo against a manifest and collect customs fees. Next, the captives were brought onto the deck in small groups, still shackled, so potential buyers could conduct preliminary inspections. The actual auction usually followed within a week. The shorter the interval, the lower the cost of feeding the prisoners. When Kalin first saw Annapolis, the alienness overwhelmed him. The buildings were wooden structures with pointed roofs, nothing like the circular clay homes with thatched coverings of his village. The air felt drier and cooler than the humid African climate he had known his entire life. The people on the docks were overwhelmingly white, with only a handful of Africans visible, all of them already enslaved. The Maryland Gazette printed an advertisement on October 1st, 1767, just imported in the ship Lord Ligonier, Captain Darvish, from the River Gambia, a cargo of choice, healthy slaves, for sale at Annapolis on Tuesday, the 7th of October. That short phrase, choice, healthy slaves, represented the final step in a commercial process that turned human lives into agricultural machinery. The 42 dead were not mentioned. The suffering endured by the survivors was irrelevant. What mattered to Maryland planners was that 98 Africans were now available to be purchased and pushed into backbreaking labor that would almost certainly kill many of them within a decade. The auction took place at a tavern near the docks. Buyers gathered to inspect the captives, checking teeth, testing muscles, searching for signs of disease, and judging overall strength. Some questioned the ship's surgeon about the origins of the Africans, believing certain ethnic groups made better workers. The surgeon described Kalen's group as Mandinka, supposedly suited to farm work and less inclined to escape than others. This assessment was disastrously incorrect, but white colonists understood African societies so poorly that they viewed all peoples as interchangeable. John Waller attended the auction on behalf of his family's tobacco plantation in Pennington County, Virginia. The Wallers were an established family. John's grandfather had owned extensive land holdings worked by dozens of enslaved people. John needed several young men to replace laborers who had recently died from disease or injuries, and he came prepared to purchase 3 or 4 captives. When he examined Kalen, he believed he'd found exactly what he needed: a teenage boy with clear physical strength, no visible illness, and a compact, muscular frame ideal for demanding labor. The fact that Kalen met his gaze directly, a sign of defiance experienced slaveholders usually noticed, John misinterpreted as intelligence rather than resistance. The bidding was quick. Several planners expressed interest, but John offered a strong price early and secured the purchase. The transaction was recorded in routine commercial language. One Negro male, approximately 17 years old, paid in full and transferred to John Waller of Pennington County. Kalen had been property of the British Crown aboard the ship. Now, he was the private property of John Waller, who held the same legal rights over him as over any other piece of farm equipment. The journey from Annapolis to Pennington County took 3 days by wagon. John transported his new purchases in a cargo bed, still shackled, with only the bare minimum of food and water. This wasn't considered cruelty by colonial standards. It was routine. Slaveholders widely believed that enslaved Africans needed to understand their inferior status from the very first moment of ownership. During the journey, John used the travel time to teach simple English commands. Words like work, stop, food, and sleep became the building blocks of forced communication. Kalen understood none of it. English bore no resemblance to Mandinka or any other African language he had encountered. The sounds were harsh, broken, without the tonal layers that made Mandinka expressive and multidimensional. Communication depended entirely on gestures and repetition, with violence serving as a primary tool to ensure compliance. The Waller plantation spread across several hundred acres along the Rappahannock River. Tobacco was the main crop, supported by fields of corn and vegetables that fed the estate. Around 30 enslaved people labored there, mostly African-born, with a few second-generation slaves born on the property. A white overseer named Connell managed the day-to-day operations under John Waller's supervision, and Connell relied heavily on intimidation and carefully chosen violence to maintain control. When Kalen arrived, the enslaved community watched with a wary calculation of people who understood exactly what the arrival of new Africans meant. Would these newcomers be cooperative or rebellious? Did they share a language with anyone already on the plantation? Could they perform skilled work that might earn lighter duties? Or would they be pushed into the fields, where labor was most punishing? John Waller's first step was renaming his new property. In his ledger, he recorded, Negro male purchased Annapolis, October 1767, given the name Toby. Renaming was not random. It was a deliberate stage in the process of turning a human being into a slave. African names were said to be too difficult for whites to pronounce, but the real purpose was erasure. A slave called Toby had no history outside the plantation, no lineage, no Africa, only what his owner permitted. When Connell introduced Kalen to the other enslaved workers, he pointed at him repeatedly, saying, Toby. Kalen's reaction came instantly, without hesitation. He pointed to himself and said clearly, Kunta Kinte. Connell assumed this was confusion, not defiance. He repeated the name louder, slower. Toby. Kunta Kinte. Kalen answered again, steady, unwavering. In that instant, the conflict that would define the next 5 decades of his life became unmistakably clear. John Waller owned Kalen's body, his labor, his movements, his survival. He could beat him, starve him, sell him, or kill him. But Kalen's name, the core of his identity, remained out of reach. Connell's solution, predictable and immediate, was violence. He struck Kalen across the face, then repeated the name Toby. Kalen answered with his true name. Connell struck him harder, drawing upon his warrior training and his father's teachings on dignity under suffering. Kalen held eye contact and repeated his name again, steady as stone. Neither Connell nor John Waller understood what they were witnessing. They saw disobedience. They did not understand a Mandinka worldview that had shaped Kalen since childhood. To him, names carried power. Identity outlasted hardship. Accepting a false name would mean surrendering a piece of his soul. Physical pain was bearable. Spiritual death was not. The confrontation lasted 3 days. Every time someone called him Toby, Kalen corrected them with his real name. Each correction resulted in punishment, beatings, withheld food, isolation. The enslaved community observed the struggle with a mix of fear and admiration. Some respected his courage. Others worried his resistance would bring harsher punishments upon them all. An older enslaved man named Fiddler, African-born but long accustomed to Virginia, approached Kalen during a work break. Speaking in a blend of broken Mandinka and English, he tried to explain the brutal truth. The white men controlled everything, even names. Resistance here was pointless. A wiser strategy, he insisted, was to accept the name Toby publicly but keep his true identity alive in private. But Kalen could not accept that compromise. His father had taught him that partial surrender to injustice inevitably led to total submission. Accepting a false name, even outwardly, would acknowledge the enslaver's right to define him, and that, in Mandinka belief, was worse than death. If he yielded here, he reasoned, he would slowly become the property they claimed he was, rather than a man held in unjust captivity. On the 4th day, John Waller ordered Kalen brought to the main house for what he called a lesson in obedience. The process was calculated and intentionally public. Waller had Kalen tied to a post in view of the entire enslaved community, then explained through Connell's translation what was about to happen. Kalen would be whipped until he accepted the name Toby. This was not punishment for misbehavior. It was instruction, a demonstration of absolute authority. The whipping began with chilling precision. Connell used a leather strap designed to inflict maximum agony without damaging Kalen badly enough to reduce his value. After each strike, Waller asked the same question. "What is your name?" "Kunta Kinte," he answered. Another blow fell. The torture continued until Kalen lost consciousness. Hours later, he awoke in the slave quarters, chained and surrounded by others who had witnessed the entire ordeal. Their expressions held sympathy, fear, resignation. Every enslaved African on the plantation had endured a similar ritual. Every one of them had learned what happened when a person tried to hold on to something the slaveholder meant to take. They had all learned that resistance led to suffering with no real chance of victory. But they noticed something that neither John Waller nor Connell had the cultural insight to see. Despite the whipping, despite the pain that had driven him into unconsciousness, Kalen had never once spoken the name Toby. That single fact resonated deeply among people who had been forced to compromise themselves in countless ways just to stay alive. The next morning, still bleeding and raw from the beating, Kalen was assigned to tobacco field work under Connell's direct supervision. Tobacco cultivation in 1767 Virginia was brutally labor-intensive. Every phase, planting seedlings, constant weeding, hand-picking tobacco worms, topping the plants at the right growth stage, harvesting by hand, transporting leaves to curing barns, required careful timing. And Kalen knew none of it. Connell's teaching method was simple and cruel. Demonstrate a task once, then beat anyone who performed it incorrectly. According to his logic, a slave who didn't understand English would learn quickly through physical punishment. In reality, Kalen spent his first weeks in a fog of confusion, always a step behind the others, men and women who had years of experience with these routines. But Kalen possessed something his captors had no understanding of: the disciplined observational skills taught to him by his father during blacksmith training. A good blacksmith watched everything: how metal glowed at various temperatures, how different hammer blows shaped it, how the sound of iron revealed when it was ready to be worked. Kalen applied those same instincts to plantation life. He studied not only what others did, but the exact timing, rhythm, and order of each task. Within 2 weeks, he had grasped enough of the tobacco cycle to avoid most beatings. He still didn't understand English commands, but he could anticipate them, watching other workers, mirroring their movements, reading Connell's gestures, and learning the daily rhythm of the fields. He kept his head low, his posture steady, and avoided drawing unnecessary attention. The enslaved community began to realize that this newcomer was not like most newly arrived Africans. Typically, recently captured men existed in a dissociated haze for months, moving mechanically, barely aware of their surroundings. Kalen was traumatized. His eyes held the same hollow stare shared by everyone who had survived the Middle Passage, but his mind was still intact, still observant, still alive inside. That resilience came from the same source as his refusal to accept a false name, his father's teachings on dignity. Kunta Kinte had raised his children within sight of a British slave fort. He taught them that freedom could be stolen at any moment, but inner identity, the truth of who you were, could only be lost if you surrendered it. Kalen had taken those lessons into captivity, and now they shaped his survival. Weeks became months, and a routine formed. He worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, ate the bare rations allotted to enslaved workers, slept in the overcrowded quarters, and endured the daily violence woven into plantation life. John Waller occasionally tested whether the whipping had succeeded by calling him Toby. Each time, Kalen would either remain silent or quietly correct him with his real name, earning a slap, but avoiding the severe punishment that might limit his ability to work. Waller found this behavior irritating, but not alarming. Some enslaved people simply took longer to break. As long as Kalen worked efficiently and didn't openly rebel, his name's stubbornness was just a minor inconvenience. Waller assumed time would eventually erode whatever pride the African clung to. But what Waller didn't understand, what he never even imagined, was that every day Kalen kept his real name alive, he achieved a tiny but meaningful victory over the system built to destroy him. And the other enslaved people saw those victories. They saw an African who had survived the Middle Passage, endured public torture, and still held on to the one thing slavery was designed to erase: selfhood. As winter approached in late 1767, Kalen had been enslaved for 6 months. Captured in July, shipped across the Atlantic, sold in October, and worked through a full season of tobacco labor. Back in Mandinka culture, he would have been celebrating his 18th birthday, taking on new adult responsibilities, possibly preparing for marriage. Instead, he was property in a foreign land, performing agricultural labor he had never trained for, unable to speak the language, and surrounded by people so crushed by slavery that many had forgotten resistance was even possible. But Kalen had not forgotten, and that fact would make what came next both inevitable and terrifying. The story of Toby, the slave who refused his name, was about to take a turn that would shock even hardened overseers of Pennington County. But before we continue, we need one thing from you. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support these narratives and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, let's uncover what happens when a man chooses freedom over survival. Winter brought horrors no one anticipated. Virginia winters in the 1760s were brutal for someone raised in tropical West Africa. Freezing temperatures were common, and the slave quarters offered almost no protection. Like most Virginia plantations, the Wallers refused to invest in adequate winter housing for enslaved people. Warm lodging cost money, and enslaved laborers who died of cold could simply be replaced by buying more Africans. Kalen's first Virginia winter introduced him to a new kind of torment. Frostbite ate at his fingers during early morning work while the ground lay frozen. Respiratory infections tore through the quarters with terrifying efficiency. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, and threadbare clothing created ideal conditions for contagion. Several enslaved workers died during that first winter, their bodies buried quietly in unmarked graves at the far edge of the plantation. It was during this brutal season that Kalen made his first attempt to escape. The idea had been growing in his mind since the day he arrived. Every hour on the plantation reinforced a single truth. His life in this place could only end one of two ways. Either he would die as property, worn down by overwork, disease, or punishment, or he would die while trying to reclaim the freedom stolen from him. To Kalen, only one of those options held dignity. He knew almost nothing about North American geography. He understood only that he had crossed a vast body of water, which meant Africa lay somewhere across the ocean behind him. He noticed the sun rose and set in similar patterns to home, suggesting he was still in comparable latitudes. Beyond that, he had no map, no sense of distance, and no understanding of the terrain he would need to cross. His plan was painfully simple. Slip away in the night, travel in whichever direction seemed least populated, and hope to reach either the coastline or a community of escaped Africans. The plan had almost no chance of success, but success wasn't the only measure that mattered. Sometimes, resistance had meaning purely because it was resistance. The escape took place in January 1768, during a week when Connell was away visiting family in Fredericksburg. The temporary replacement overseer was far less strict about nighttime head counts, and Kalen noticed something crucial. If every slave appeared present at the first evening check, no one bothered to count again later. Winter cold kept people inside, making movement after dark less noticeable. Around midnight, Kalen slipped out through a rear door of the slave quarters, its lock broken for weeks, and crept into the frozen night. He moved cautiously, aware that dogs might be roaming the property, and knowing several white families lived within half a mile. His clothing was nothing but thin, ragged fabric meant for work, not winter, but he had no alternatives. For the first 3 miles, everything went according to his fragile plan. He followed a narrow creek northward, reasoning that streams eventually fed rivers, and rivers led to the sea. But the physical toll was immediate. His crude shoes did nothing against the cold. Within an hour, he could barely feel his feet. The winter forest was alien, silent, sharp, and lifeless. Nothing like the dense, warm African woodlands he understood. Near dawn, he heard dogs barking behind him. Instantly, he understood what that meant. The plantation had discovered his absence, and professional slave hunters were already on his trail. These were not farm dogs. They were trained hounds capable of tracking a scent for miles. What followed showed the merciless efficiency of the slave-catching system in colonial Virginia. Connell had returned earlier than expected and noticed Kalen missing during the morning work call. He immediately sent word to Thomas Maddox, a well-known slave catcher operating across Pennington County. Maddox kept a pack of trained hounds and a team of assistants whose livelihood depended on capturing runaways. His method was systematic. He began at the escape point, allowed the dogs to pick up Kalen's scent, then followed at a measured pace, letting the animals lead. Maddox was paid a fixed rate for every successful recovery, plus expenses. If the runaway resisted, he was authorized to use whatever force necessary, as long as the enslaved person survived and remained able to work afterward. Kalen had traveled perhaps 8 miles when the dogs found him. The confrontation happened in a clearing where the terrain offered no chance to hide or defend himself. Maddox's assistants surrounded him while the hounds formed a living barrier, growling and lunging whenever he tried to step back. Through gestures and broken English, Maddox indicated Kalen should surrender peacefully. Kalen didn't comply immediately, not out of defiance, but because he didn't fully understand the commands. Maddox ordered his men to seize him. They bound Kalen's hands, looped a rope around his neck, and began the long walk back toward the Waller plantation. Maddox followed his standard practice of marching captured runaways along the main roads in daylight. This humiliating parade served several purposes. It reminded enslaved people that escape was futile, advertised Maddox's effectiveness to potential clients, and reassured white communities that their control remained absolute. By the time they returned to plantation, Connell and John Waller were waiting. What happened next would be remembered by every enslaved worker who witnessed it. Not because the punishment was unusual, but because of what Kalen's response revealed about human endurance. Waller had Kalen tied to the same post where he had been whipped for refusing the name Toby. But this punishment had an entirely different purpose. The naming whipping had been about asserting dominance. This beating was about terror, creating a spectacle so horrific that no one else would dare attempt escape. Connell delivered the whipping with cold precision, striking Kalen's back in a pattern intended to maximize agony while avoiding blows that might cause permanent damage or reduce his labor value. Between each set of lashes, Waller demanded, "Will you run again?" The expected response was immediate fear, crying, begging, swearing submission. Instead, Kalen, drawing on a depth of strength even he didn't fully understand, remained mostly silent. He didn't weep, didn't plead, didn't break. His silence unsettled Waller more than any screaming would have. A slave who screamed showed he understood his powerlessness. A slave who suffered quietly had some inner strength that violence could not extinguish. After 30 lashes, enough to turn Kalen's back into a torn, bleeding lattice of wounds, Waller paused, shaken by the lack of emotional collapse. Furious and unsettled, he ordered Kalen locked in a storage shed for a week with barely enough food or water to keep him alive. The week of isolation gave Kalen time to reflect on the consequences of his escape attempt. The physical pain was excruciating, but familiar. He'd endured similar suffering on the slave ship, injuries during warrior training in Africa, and he knew the body could endure more pain than most people imagined. What troubled him more was the strategic failure of his escape. 8 miles in 12 hours was far too little. The hounds found him easily, and he learned almost nothing about the terrain between the plantation and any conceivable freedom. But the attempt had revealed something crucial about the plantation system. Its power rested on terror, not physical walls. There were no fences around the Waller property, no guard stationed at its borders. The true prison was psychological, the understanding that escape meant being hunted, mauled, and returned for punishment. Kalen began to wonder whether future attempts required a different strategy. Rather than bolting blindly into the night, perhaps he needed to learn English, gather information, understand the landscape, identify allies, and wait for the right conditions. That kind of planning required patience as Mandinka warrior training had never emphasized, but also recognized that impulsive escape attempts only demonstrated defiance without offering even a small chance of success. When Kalen returned to the fields after a week of isolation, the enslaved community treated him with a quiet mixture of respect and worry. No one spoke openly about the escape. Talking about resistance near white people was a death sentence. But Kalen noticed subtle shifts in how they behaved around him. Fiddler increased his English lessons, giving Kalen vocabulary that could help him survive. Other workers shared small portions of their food, recognizing that he was being intentionally underfed as ongoing punishment. These small gestures formed connections that John Waller and Connell never understood. From the white perspective, enslaved people were isolated individuals, competing for small advantages. The truth was the opposite. Shared trauma had created bonds of solidarity, silent, powerful, and invisible to their oppressors. By spring of 1768, Kalin had been enslaved for 10 months. His English had improved enough to understand basic commands and express simple ideas. He'd mastered the tobacco cycle well enough to avoid most beatings. And for the first time, he began to understand that the Waller plantation was just one node in a vast system of forced labor stretching across Virginia and beyond. This understanding came mostly from Fiddler, who had lived in Virginia long enough to grasp the full structure of colonial slavery. There were hundreds of plantations in Pennington County alone, and thousands more across Virginia. The entire regional economy ran on enslaved labor: tobacco, corn, wheat, livestock. In many counties, enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists. Yet white society maintained control through calculated terror and absolute legal power to inflict violence. Fiddler also explained something that initially made no sense to Kalin. There were enslaved people who had never seen Africa, men and women born on these plantations whose parents and grandparents had also been enslaved. They grew up speaking English, practicing Christianity, and knowing nothing of Mandinka culture or any other African tradition. To white America, these people were considered the ideal slaves, detached from their ancestral identity, easier to control. This forced Kalin to confront a horrifying truth. Slavery was not temporary. It wasn't a phase that would end when enough Africans resisted. It was a self-replicating system designed to produce new slaves generation after generation. Children born into slavery belonged automatically to their parents' owner. Freedom had no obvious path. In May 1768, Kalin made his second escape attempt. This one showed more planning. He had stolen food scraps over several weeks and hidden them in the quarters. He identified a route that followed established roads rather than slipping blindly through the wilderness. His English was now just good enough to misdirect suspicious white travelers by claiming he was running an errand for his master. Buying him precious hours before anyone realized a lie. The escape lasted 3 days. Then Maddox's hounds found him hiding in a barn just 20 miles from the Waller plantation. The recapture followed the same ritual as before. Maddox and his assistants surrounded him, tied him, and marched him back along public roads to serve as a living warning to every enslaved person who saw him. But this time, John Waller responded differently. Kalin had shown that standard punishment wouldn't stop him. Waller needed something harsher, something that would shatter the possibility of escape forever. The method he chose, cutting off half of Kalin's right foot, was a common practice in colonial Virginia for habitual runaways. The logic was brutally practical. A slave who could not run still had value as a field worker, but could no longer flee successfully. Planners across the South used this mutilation often enough that crude medical procedures existed to reduce infection and speed recovery. Dr. William Waller, John's brother and a trained physician, performed the amputation. It took place in the plantation's tool shed. Kalin was tied down while several white men held him still. No anesthetic was used. It was considered expensive and unnecessary for a slave. Pain was part of the punishment. Historical records rarely capture the psychological devastation of such an act. To John Waller, it was nothing more than modifying property, no different than branding livestock or hobbling a horse. To Kalin, it was state-sanctioned torture inflicted by a man who believed he had both legal and moral authority to permanently maim another human being. The amputation accomplished its purpose. Kalin would never again be able to run far or fast. Future escape attempts would be almost impossible, but the mutilation had an unintended consequence. It made Kalin unforgettable. Among the enslaved people, stories spread quickly about the African who tried to escape twice despite knowing the cost, who endured mutilation rather than surrender entirely, who maintained his true name despite years of punishment. These stories circulated through the quiet, informal networks connecting enslaved communities across Virginia. Kalen became a symbol of resistance, not because his resistance ever succeeded, but because it endured despite overwhelming, crushing odds. During his recovery from the amputation, confined to the quarters and unable to work, Kalen held long conversations with Fiddler and other elders. These discussions revealed layers of plantation life he had never understood before. The other enslaved people had developed complex, ingenious methods of preserving dignity despite their circumstances. They maintained secret family ties across plantations. They practiced African spiritual traditions during hidden nighttime gatherings. They taught their children about freedom, even when freedom seemed unimaginable. Kalen also learned that survival under slavery required many different strategies. Some enslaved people cooperated with white overseers in exchange for minor privileges. Foremen, house servants, drivers. Others turned to Christianity, using its teachings to make sense of their suffering and sustain hope. Still others had developed psychological methods of detaching, performing obedience outwardly while preserving resistance in private. Kalen realized his own approach. Refusing the slave name, attempting escape despite the odds, was one form of resistance, but not the only one. The choices others made were not cowardice. They were different answers to the same impossible question. How do you remain human in a system designed to erase your humanity? When Kalen returned to work after healing, his responsibilities shifted. Because the amputation limited his mobility, he was no longer useful as a field hand. Dr. William Waller, who had purchased Kalen from his brother after mutilation, reassigned him to garden work and, eventually, to driving the family's buggy around the county. This role brought Kalen into closer contact with the Waller household and exposed him to the inner workings of white colonial society. He observed their daily routines, their social visits with other plantation owners, their religious practices, and their casual conversations about enslaved people as though they were animals or tools. This forced Kalen to confront a disturbing truth. The white people who enslaved him were not monsters in their own minds. They were ordinary, socially respected people raised in a culture that normalized absolute power over black bodies. They attended church, celebrated holidays, raised children, and believed sincerely in their own morality, all while owning human beings. This realization did not make Kalen sympathize with them. Instead, it clarified the scale of the system he faced. Slavery was not upheld by a handful of cruel men. It was upheld by an entire society, its laws, its churches, its economy, and its culture. As years passed, 1769, 1770, 1771, Kalen's role on the plantation grew more layered. He became fluent in English, which opened his understanding of the world around him. He observed the plantation's inner workings closely and realized that while he could never escape physically, he could resist in another way, by preserving identity, culture, and memory. His name remained Kunta Kinte, no matter what the Wallers called him. His identity as a Mandinka warrior remained intact, despite enslavement. During this period, Kalen developed a relationship with an enslaved woman named Belle, the plantation cook. Belle was Virginia-born, but the daughter of African parents. Her life existed at the intersection of two worlds, African memory and American bondage. She spoke English as her primary language, but remembered fragments of her parents' native tongue. She practiced a blended spiritual system combining Christianity with African traditions, and she had learned how to survive by balancing outward cooperation with quiet, internal resistance. Their relationship deepened over months, spent talking in the kitchen, while Kalen waited for Dr. Waller to finish tending to the family inside. Belle recognized in Kalen something she rarely encountered, an African-born man who had held on to his identity despite years of brutality. Kalen recognized in Belle a person who preserved humanity in a place engineered to destroy it. In 1772, Belle became pregnant with Kalen's child. The pregnancy carried profound meaning. In Mandinka culture, having children was a sacred act, continuing the family line, passing down ancestral knowledge, ensuring your identity outlived your body. But under slavery, children inherited their mother's status. Belle's child would be born into bondage. Their daughter, whom Kaylin insisted on naming Kizzy, a Mandinka word meaning "you stay put," was born in 1773. Kaylin approached fatherhood with the same determination he brought to defending his name. He would teach Kizzy African words, tell her the stories of her grandfather Kunta Kinte, and make sure she understood that her true heritage stretched far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. These lessons were given in secret, in quiet moments away from white eyes. Kaylin held his newborn daughter and spoke to her in Mandinka, describing the village of Jiru she would never see. He whispered his family lineage to her, ensuring that even if Kizzy grew up enslaved, she would still know that her lineage came from free people with culture, history, and dignity. Belle watched these moments with a mixture of pride and fear. She understood why Kaylin needed Kizzy to inherit Mandinka identity, but she also understood the danger more intimately than he did. If the Wallers discovered that Kaylin was teaching African culture to his daughter, they might punish him by selling the child away, something Belle had already endured twice. Those losses had carved wounds so deep they never truly healed. This tension, preserving identity versus protecting children, would define Kizzy's early life. Kaylin wanted her to remember Africa, her language, her ancestors. Belle wanted her to master English, practice Christianity publicly, and cultivate the skills that might earn her slightly safer treatment under slavery. Both were acts of love. Both were acts of survival. As Kizzy grew from infant to young child, Kaylin taught her a quiet vocabulary of Mandinka words: cow, river, harvest, guitar. Words that held no practical meaning in Virginia, but represented a world beyond bondage. When little Kizzy pointed at a stream and said Cambi Balongo, the Mandinka name for the Gambia River, she was speaking a language her enslavers could not understand, maintaining a heritage they could not erase. In 1780, when Kizzy was 7, something happened that tested everything Kaylin had worked to give her. Missy Ann, the young niece of Dr. William Waller, began visiting the plantation frequently. She and Kizzy were nearly the same age, and in the innocent way children sometimes behave, Missy Ann viewed Kizzy as a friend, not as property. This friendship created a dangerous contradiction. Missy Ann started teaching Kizzy to read and write, unaware that literacy for enslaved people was illegal in Virginia. The law forbade slave education specifically because reading enabled escape, forging passes, understanding maps, spreading ideas. But Missy Ann, with the innocence of childhood, simply wanted to share knowledge with someone she liked. Kaylin and Belle faced an impossible choice. If they forbade the lessons, they would protect Kizzy from the harsh punishment that awaited any literate slave. But they would also deny her the power that literacy could someday provide. If they allowed the lessons, they risked catastrophic consequences if the Wallers discovered them. In the end, they chose hope over fear. They allowed Missy Ann to teach her, but warned Kizzy never to reveal her literacy to any white person besides Missy Ann. This choice would define the course of her life and nearly destroy theirs. By 1785, Kizzy had entered her teenage years. She embodied all the contradictions of enslaved womanhood. Born in America but raised with African knowledge, enslaved but literate, connected to white society through Missy and yet fully aware of its brutality. Around this time, a young enslaved man named Noah arrived on a neighboring plantation. Born in Virginia and close in age to Kizzy, he met her during church gatherings, one of the few times enslaved people from multiple plantations could interact under the watchful eyes of overseers. Their relationship blossomed under impossible conditions, genuine affection amid a system engineered to crush human bonds. In 1786, Noah decided to escape. His goal was to reach Pennsylvania, where gradual emancipation had begun. Once free, he planned to somehow return and help Kizzy escape as well. It was a plan with almost no chance of success, but Noah was young enough to believe that love could dent a system built on violence. He asked Kizzy to forge him a traveling pass, Only literate slaves could write such documents, and Kesey's literacy made her uniquely capable. She knew the risk was enormous. Forging a pass was not just forbidden. It was a crime that could lead to torture, branding, or sale deep into the South. But Noah insisted that without the pass, he had no chance at all. 16-year-old Kesey, in love and desperate for hope, agreed. Noah's escape failed within 2 days. Slave catchers found the forged pass on him and quickly traced the unfamiliar handwriting back to Kesey. When Dr. Waller learned that his cook's daughter not only could read and write, but had used her literacy to facilitate an escape, his reaction was instant and merciless. Kesey was sold to a trader within 24 hours, a man who specialized in transporting enslaved teenagers to plantations in North Carolina. Belle and Kaylin had no chance to intervene. One day, Kesey was living with her parents. The next, she was chained in a caravan, carried hundreds of miles away, with no possibility of contact for the rest of their lives. For Kaylin and Belle, this was the culmination of their deepest fear, the most devastating proof of the slave system's power. They had raised a daughter with dignity, taught her identity and courage, and watched her become a remarkable young woman. And then the system they'd resisted for decades demonstrated its ultimate cruelty. It could take their child at will, and they were legally powerless to stop it. Kaylin's reaction would define the rest of his life. He had survived capture in Africa. He had survived the Middle Passage. He had survived beatings, the amputation of his foot, and years of relentless dehumanization without surrendering his identity. But losing Kesey broke something in him that nothing else ever had. Historical accounts show that after Kesey's sale, Kaylin became increasingly withdrawn. He continued to drive Dr. Waller's buggy, continued to carry himself with dignity, and never once forgot his name. But among the enslaved people, enslaved community began noticing changes in him. Longer stretches of silence, fewer signs of the quiet, stubborn resistance that had defined his earlier years, a heavy stillness that suggested he had accepted one devastating truth. The system he had fought for decades would always strike hardest at the things he loved. This shift was not surrender in the traditional sense. Kaylin never believed slavery was justified, nor did he ever accept that he deserved his status. But he had learned through unbearable experience that identity and defiance, no matter how fiercely maintained, could not always shield a person from the worst cruelty slavery could deliver: the loss of one's child through a simple commercial transaction. The years moved forward with grim inevitability. Kaylin worked. He aged. He watched the plantation economy expand, watched more Africans arrive through the slave trade, watched new generations of enslaved children grow up never knowing Africa or freedom. He witnessed white society strengthen its elaborate justification for enslavement, legal, religious, and cultural frameworks that insisted people like him were destined for bondage. In 1810, Belle died from pneumonia, one of the many diseases that swept to the overcrowded, poorly ventilated slave quarters. Her death cut deeply, another fracture in Kaylin's long battered heart. Kaylin continued to work for another 12 years, until age and accumulated injuries made even light labor impossible. In 1822, at roughly 70 years old, Kunta Kinte died on the Waller plantation. He died still enslaved, still separated from his daughter, still carrying the weight of the name no white man ever managed to take from him. The plantation ledger recorded his death with chilling simplicity. Toby, approximately 70 years old, died of natural causes. No mention of Africa, no mention of the Middle Passage, no mention of escape attempts, the mutilation, or the decades of resistance. Just an entry noting that property had been lost and would need replacing. But the enslaved people of Virginia remembered him differently. They passed down stories of the African who refused to answer to his slave name, stories of the man who tried to escape even after losing part of his foot, stories of endurance, dignity, and defiance in the face of a system designed to annihilate both body and spirit. Those stories traveled far beyond the Waller plantation. They moved through the South, carried in whispered memories and oral traditions that slavery could never fully extinguish. Kesey, sold to Thomas Lee's plantation in North Carolina, survived into the 1850s. She bore a son named George, conceived through rape by her enslaver. George grew up tending fighting birds and became known as Chicken George. He would eventually gain his freedom, and his children would live to see the legal end of slavery in 1865. Across 7 generations, Kalen's story endured. His name traveled in memory when written records were destroyed or never kept. His lineage persisted through oral tradition, the same tradition that had preserved Mandinka history for centuries. In the 1960s, one of his descendants, a writer named Alex Haley, began tracing his family's genealogy. His research, through census data, plantation documents, and long silence histories, led him back across the Atlantic to the village of Jiru in the Gambia. Their Grats, traditional oral historians, recounted tales of a young man named Kaulo, captured around 1767 and never seen again. Haley's book, Roots, the Saga of an American Family, introduced Kalen's story to millions. It reignited interest in African-American genealogy, forced conversations about the lasting injuries of slavery, and proved that enslaved people were not faceless victims. They were individuals who resisted in the only ways available to them. But the core truth at the heart of this story is not triumphant, nor is it comforting. It is the truth America has spent centuries avoiding. A 17-year-old Mandinka warrior was captured, shipped across the ocean, and enslaved for 55 years. He tried to escape twice and lost part of his foot as punishment. He taught his daughter a heritage she would never fully experience. He resisted, quietly but relentlessly, by refusing to forget who he was. He died on the same plantation where he had worked most of his life, still legally considered property. The horror of Kalen's story is not that it was unique. It is that it was ordinary. Hundreds of thousands of Africans endured similar trauma. Millions lived and died in bondage under conditions too brutal to fully articulate. Slavery in America operated with legal approval, religious justification, and widespread public support for nearly 3 centuries. What makes Kalen's story significant isn't that he escaped or overthrew his oppressors. It's that, despite everything, he remembered himself. He kept his name. He kept his identity as a Mandinka warrior. He passed that identity to his daughter. She passed it to her son. And it continued across generations until it reached the present day. That continuity, fragile, miraculous, and hard-fought, represent a form of resistance that slavery's architects never fully defeated. They could enslave bodies. They could inflict violence without limit. They could tear families apart. But they could not completely erase the knowledge that enslaved people came from cultures older than America itself, from civilizations with languages, stories, and histories that predated slavery and survived it. This story reveals something fundamental about the American experience. This nation was built on a foundation of systematic brutality. Its prosperity came from enslaved labor, tobacco, cotton, sugar, rice. The legal and religious systems created to justify that brutality shaped American society long after slavery's official end. Kalen's legacy is not easy. It is not redemptive. It is a reminder of what was stolen, what was endured, and what was never fully repaired. So let me ask you, does knowing the full truth change how you understand American history? Is maintaining identity under unimaginable suffering a victory? Or is that simply a way of softening the unbearable? Tell us in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation about why these stories still matter. If this history gave you chills, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the reality behind America's past. And remember, this is an ancient history. The last person born into slavery died in the 1970s. Its consequences are still shaping the world we live in. Thanks for watching Liturgy of Fear. See you in the next video.